Hi, guys. Welcome back to Mind What Matters. This morning, I am going to be interviewing someone pretty fantastic. Nikki is still not with us. She is still filming in Greece, but I hope to have her back with me next week. One of the things that I have been wanting to talk about with her on this podcast for quite some time is sort of the financial aspects of navigating senior living and how to prepare for making the tough decision of when your loved one is no longer safe at home. There's a lot of things that I think people don't think about before they're in a crisis moment. And if you're listening to this and you've been in an ER with your parent, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This can be a really tricky thing to navigate. And I have found the literal best person in the world to talk to you guys about. Her name is Christen Bergeron. She has spent 25 years inside the senior living industry. She's been working in leadership positions inside of communities and at the corporate level, where she saw firsthand how families are expected to make these major decisions without ever getting the full picture. Now she works exclusively for families, helping adult children understand what their parent needs, what it costs, how to pay for it, and what to do before they're trying to figure out in real time. She's a mom of 3, based in New Hampshire, and the founder of Navigating Senior Living, where she's built a community of over 350,000 across Instagram and Facebook, sharing what most people aren't told until they're in the middle of making these hard decisions. Welcome, Christen. Thanks so much for being here on our podcast today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, as guys, we were talking just for a few minutes before I hit the record button. I am so excited to have found this person. This Christen is who I wish I had found about 10 years ago. And I was giggling with her that, I sort of don't really love Instagram, guys. You'll know this about me already, probably from things I've said in the past, but I cannot wait to get it off my phone. My producers of the podcast have agreed to sort of take it over, and I don't think I ever would have found you had I not looked and started searching in this arena like when I did. And I was just blown away with your wealth of knowledge. Obviously, in the industry as a whole, you've been in it, but your ability to sort of talk about it in a way that is very easily understandable, easily digestible. And I am just pumped. I'm going to throw one question at you after the other. I get a lot of calls from a lot of scared people that are in the middle of crisis. They have gone into either an ER or a hospital stay with a parent or a loved one who's either injured or had a fall or had an episode at home that was unmanageable by the caregivers. And they're all the same in that they are caught completely off guard. They're scared. They're trying to make a decision, as you put it so well, in real time. And when emotions are high and tensions are boiling over and family members are all getting involved, it's just the worst time to make a good decision. So, I'm just going to jump right in. And the first thing I want to ask you is, Nikki and I always do this, but it seems kind of cheesy, but I would love to know what kind of brought you into this field. Did you have a personal experience, or did you have a family member that had Alzheimer's or dementia? What made you get into senior living in the first place?
So when I first went into the industry, I did so because my mother was a nurse and she worked in long-term care. So she was a nursing director in a nursing home. And so I grew up with that environment, visiting her at work and hearing her stories. And I always loved seniors. And so my first job even was in a nursing home as an evening receptionist. And so I was always around that environment. And I went into college and majored in healthcare administration and really focused on working in senior living. So my first job out of college was working in a nursing home, actually, as an administrator. And I did that for a few years and then transitioned into the assisted living world, which back in the early 2000s was still relatively new as an industry. Has grown a lot. Yeah, it really was. It was. And people didn't know a lot about it.
Was everything just skilled nursing before that?
It was skilled nursing, long-term care communities, nursing homes. So assisted living has grown a ton over the last 25 years. So I went into assisted living after that and spent the balance of my career there. So grew up within the industry, so started running individual assisted living communities as an executive director. both as traditional assisted living, we call it, and memory care assisted living
Hmm.
communities. And then had grown to be in regional positions where I would oversee groups of communities, and then eventually worked on the corporate side in operations for two different senior living companies as a vice president of operations. So I've seen it from within the communities, operating individual communities. And then I've been able to see it on the other side, on the corporate side, and how those decisions are made. So it's really been interesting to be able to have that perspective to share with families, to
Yeah.
know what exactly it's like to be making those decisions on the company side. And for me to be able to now be working exclusively with families, guiding them on those decisions and letting them know exactly some of the pitfalls to avoid, how to
Mm.
plan, and what to do, because it is completely overwhelming.
Yeah.
And caregivers are trying to balance their own families, their own busy lives, their children, their jobs, and try to support an aging parent. And it's incredibly difficult. So I've been
Yeah,
able to
it
have
is.
this unique perspective of having seen it on both ends.
I think that's what makes you so uniquely qualified to be the one answering all of these questions. You definitely have seen it from every angle. You know the ins and the outs. You know, like the red flags, the bad parts, the good
Hmm.
parts. And I can't wait to just drill you about all of it. Candidly, and you know this, you shared that you would listen to the podcast Nikki and I did, where I talked about my own experience with assisted living and,
Hmm.
well, independent and then assisted living. And it was truly horrible. I mean, it was one of the worst experiences of my life. And I think that you either have a great experience or you don't have a good experience. I don't
Hmm.
really hear a lot of people saying, it's fine. It's okay. Like, it's always one or the other, which I find so interesting. Like, you either have families who are like, I got the best care. My loved one was so taken care of. I felt nurtured. They were definitely nurtured and looked, out and were well cared for. Or it's the opposite, like I was
Hmm.
pitted against the nurses and the staff, and I felt like I couldn't, voice anything. This is one I hear a lot, is that, they kept trying to put me on a schedule, and I didn't like that because I wanted to check on my loved one when I wanted to check on.
Hmm.
And it's just there's so many similar threads that I hear from all the families that I talk to that call me, asking for help or saying, "What do you think I should do about this or that?" And it's definitely one of those industries that it's like it's not exactly like going into, like a chain restaurant where you just know what to expect, right?
No,
It can
right.
even be different across, like, Brookdale Senior Living buildings, let's take, for example. Some might be good, others,
Hmm.
maybe not so much, I don't know. Okay, well, I don't know where to dive in, but I would say the first thing I think we should talk about, just because it's where so many families land, is what do you do? Or I'm trying to think how to best phrase this. Let's pretend that your family member is suffering from, like, a
Hmm.
critical event. So they've either fallen at home and they've broken a bone. I just had somebody talk to me about this maybe 3 weeks ago. She called and she's like, "I don't know what to do. My mom is, 80 years old. She's still living independently. She has a roommate who's her best friend, and
Mm.
she fell. It's her 3rd fall. She's now broken her femur, I think, which is
Oh
gonna
boy.
a ton of additional, PT and physical therapy, probably some sort of
Hmm.
like outpatient, you know, therapy. But I would imagine someone like that and at that age would have to go into some type of not skilled nursing, but whatever the next thing after you leave the hospital is, for
Hmm.
some sort of support until she can be on her own independently. And now this woman is totally hell bent on going back home. She does not want to
Hmm.
go into assisted living. She's told her daughter repeatedly, "Nope, I'm going home." And it's clearly unsafe for her to do so. I mean, I've said that. Like her roommate or friend is her same age or older. They are not responsible for her. It's not a family member. But this is common, right? Like, these are the
Oh,
real people
absolutely.
out there in the real world who don't have $7,000 or $8,000 a month to put
Hmm.
towards an assisted living facility. So what do you tell a family? their loved one's fallen, they've broken a bone, or they've had an event where maybe they've become so severely agitated that the caregiver doesn't know what to do, or they've wandered out of the house and the paramedics and the ambulance has been called, or sorry, excuse me, the fire
Mhm.
department's been called, and all of a sudden you're in this like hot button event where everyone's panicked. What's the first step? What do you do? Do you consult with a social worker at the hospital? Do you start calling around facilities right then? Like, give us the whole rundown of sort of where you would take a family in this
Mhm.
situation.
You're absolutely right, and this is such a common scenario because people don't always plan for this, and it's not because they don't wanna do right by their loved ones, but it's completely overwhelming as to where to even start, and so
Right.
often it ends up that families just think, well, we'll deal with it when we have to deal with it. And so, if you take the scenario of, say, somebody falling and fracturing a hip and going into the hospital, for example, which is common,
Hmm.
usually what you would see is they would have that hospital stay. And often the path after that would be to skilled nursing and rehab.
Okay.
Um, and there's a lot to consider there as well, because you need, in order to, say, use your Medicare benefit for that, from the hospital to skilled nursing, you need to have a qualifying hospital stay
It's
of
like 3 nights, right?
3 midnights. Yes. Yep. 3 midnights. And there's a lot to that as well, because you have to be admitted as inpatient. And I've worked with a lot of families where actually their loved one did have a fracture, was in the hospital, but was considered under observation status maybe for one of those nights. And then for two of the nights was inpatient, but you need to have 3 midnights as inpatient in order to be able to trigger that Medicare skilled benefit to receive that rehab in a
What can you
nursing.
say? What can you say to the doctor or whomever's in charge to sort of push that along if they're pushing back against you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I always tell families to ask that question, which people don't know to ask that. So, are they
Mm-mm.
admitted as inpatient or are they still under observation status? And then talk to them about how your goal is to make sure that they have a safe discharge. And typically, in that scenario, the safe discharge would need to be to a skilled nursing stay to receive that rehab that they need. And in order for Medicare to pay for that, they need the 3 midnights. And usually, when you have that conversation with first the physician and then the case manager, I have seen families successfully be able to have that status put as inpatient or allow them to stay an additional night to be able to activate the benefit. But often you do have to ask and have that conversation, and people have no idea that you're supposed to have that conversation, nor should you know that going into it, because people really don't talk about that.
No.
So being able to
What
ask
if
exactly.
I'm sorry, I just have to interject here because people probably don't know this either. What if it's just an ER visit? What if it's something
Hmm.
for like, they've cut their hand or,
Yeah.
when they fell, they just needed stitches for something like maybe on their head or what have you. An ER doctor wouldn't know that you needed a 3-night stay either in order
Right.
to potentially then have Medicaid triggered to move them into assisted living even. So how can
Hmm.
you sort of explain to doctors and nurses in the ER what you're sort of after?
If they're in the ER, then typically they're not going. And if it's something just like they were sent there maybe because they did have that episode of agitation and they wandered off, or they did have that injury or cut, but it's not something that they would then admit them for, then often that can be really challenging for families, because you're then working with ER staff whose goal is to really keep people moving through the ER and have people leave and get out and go home. So, working with the hospital social worker is definitely something that I always recommend. So, asking to speak to the social worker and having a conversation about what your goals are and how you're concerned that home isn't safe. And then thinking about, okay, so if home isn't safe, then what is the next step? So would it be having them have a caregiver at home for a period of time while we do pursue assisted living? Or do we think that we're going to try to move directly into assisted living from the hospital? Which all goes back to then hopefully having made some sort of a plan ahead of time.
Right.
Because when you're under the gun like that and you're having to face an urgent decision, often you have to take what's available. because there may not be availability in your preferred community for assisted living, and
Hmm.
you may end up paying more than you really are able to sustain if you're having to then just to piece it together, to do a patchwork type of support system in the meantime. And families do end up in crisis this way.
Right.
So it all
Because
goes
then you
back
wind
to
up
then,
having to like move again. And every time you
yeah,
move them, they decline. And you're sort of just getting into an unnecessary, you know, just issue, there.
right.
What can you say about that process? Like when you are a family member who is, kind of the caregiver of somebody with Alzheimer's or dementia, um, what is going through their mind? What are they really worried about? What are they thinking about? What are some of the things that they are like that are on their heart? You know what I mean? Like what are the things they're
Mhm.
really internally struggling with? I mean, I know I could say what mine were, but like
Mhm.
let's just take it more generic. I mean, you've seen this from
Yeah.
I would imagine hundreds of thousands of people at this point.
Mhm. I think first off, what I see the most, and I absolutely understand that, of course, as a daughter too, is a tremendous amount of guilt that
Mhm,
really they feel like they should be the ones to provide that care. And so they struggle with, then what do I do? How do I be able to support my mom or dad and have them be in the right environment when they themselves feel just a tremendous amount of guilt about what really
mhm,
they should be doing. And because of that, people end up having their loved ones stay at home maybe for longer than maybe safe.
mhm,
Um, so when I talk to families, I always talk about safety. You really just have to think about as a caregiver or as a daughter or son of someone with dementia, what is going to be the safest environment for them first off, and often that's not at home if family isn't able to be there, or if you're not able to provide caregivers one-on-one in that home environment, because that's often unrealistic. So how can you get them to a safe environment first, even though you may feel so much guilt on your
mhm.
heart about having to make that transition, but you have to remember that they do need to be in that safe place. So that's what I always tell families first. And it's hard. It can be extremely difficult. And just like you spoke about your own experience moving your mom to a community, it can be,
Mhm.
it's really hard when you first make that move, but often you have to.
Well, in my mom's case, I just don't think she was quite ready, and that's
Mhm.
where, that's obviously what led to a lot of the issues that we were dealing with, but it wasn't my choice, unfortunately. Um, but what do you think is the biggest hurdle? Like, one of the things that's so interesting about, like, the job that I have is seeing the really vast divide between how so many Americans are facing this disease. Um,
Mhm.
Fortunately, we had the means to move my mom into somewhere, obviously we did it before I think it was time, but, like, had there come a point at which I was like, "Okay, like, this is no longer safe for anybody.
Mhm.
This is past the point where, like, I could manage caregivers at home, whatever." We had the means to move her, but so many people don't. And
Mhm.
that's really, I mean, ultimately, that's what Mind What Matters exists for, is
Right.
we give care grants to people who are facing, the actual end stages with their loved ones at home, and it is really
Mhm.
hard. But what are the things that you would tell family members to look for, um, just to how to, like, know it's no longer safe? Like, when is the day you should, "Hey, we need to have a conversation about getting a caregiver in for mom or dad"? Like, what are some of the signs you should look for just knowing that the disease has progressed to a place where your loved one just shouldn't be living independently and trying it on their own? And then the second part of that question is, why do you think our parents are so resentful and
Mm.
obstinate against accepting that type of care when it
Yeah.
is time for it?
So, some of the main things to look for with safety if they're living at home is thinking about, are they going to exit? So, say if they do like to walk, or if they are likely to become more disoriented at night, do you think that they may
Mhm,
end up leaving the home and not knowing how to get back? And that's
mhm.
something that happens frequently. And that's often the tipping point for people when they are at home with dementia and maybe otherwise physically healthy, but
Is the
cognitively
wandering.
Yeah, is the wandering. The second is thinking about what could be a safety issue for cooking in the kitchen. So even if
Mhm.
they only use a microwave, I speak to families a lot who say we disconnected the stove and she only uses the microwave, but you can still start a fire with a microwave.
Right. Right.
So anything around that kitchen piece can end up being a really big safety concern. So those are the two biggest ones that often end up having people tip into needing to do something different for supportive care
Or
with
falls,
dementia.
right?
And falls is another piece exactly. If you're starting to see that they're not able to manage that environment and they are having falls, maybe it's at a particular time, or maybe it's just maybe in when they're getting up at night, say trying to navigate to the bathroom and there's nobody there, and then they're experiencing those falls. That can often end up being, unfortunately, something that can result in a fracture, and then you're having to
Mhm.
make another whole set of decisions. Um, so trying to work through that environment to make sure it's safe from a lighting perspective and what can you do to make those modifications?
What do you think about all of this new technology that is allowing caregivers from afar to kind of check on their parents? So, like, there's this new one, I can't remember what it's called right now. Oh gosh, that's gonna drive me crazy later, but it's like a thing that comes through the television where, like, you can actually come on to their TV in the middle of
Uh-huh.
the day and be like, "Hey, mom, it's time to go take your medicine," or, "Hey, mom, did you switch the clothes from the washer to the dryer?" Or, "Don't forget, I'm coming to pick you up at dinner. Why don't you write it down in front of you?"
Mhm.
What do you think about all of that? Or, like, the medicine reminders or the automatic dispensers daily? Like, do you think that those things are ultimately, just a big fat Band-Aid on an otherwise problem that really needs more personal attention? I have my own feelings about that, and especially with, like, a lot of the apps and stuff like that, because
Mhm.
I feel like the last thing we need in this space is tools to make this even more isolating for the
Right.
individual, when what we really need is to, like, lean in with more personal, one-on-one human interaction.
Mhm.
So I'm torn on it because I see how it can be beneficial. Like, let's say you're living in Omaha and your mom is in,
Right.
s you know, Sacramento. This could be a great thing to buy you 6 months or a year, where they just need constant reminders, but they're otherwise okay to just kinda, like, putter around the house. But it's just a slippery slope, and I think it's really hard to sort of know when you're relying on guides like that, or tools in that form. You really almost
Mhm.
don't know what's truly happening in the home. What are your thoughts on it?
It is a Band-Aid, absolutely, and it can work, and you can layer on multiple Band-Aids sometimes to be able to support folks. Think about the automated medication dispensers as an example. Um, Things like that. But when I work with families and we talk through scenarios when they're thinking about a camera, or say just like your scenario you brought up, so they're out of state, they're thinking about setting up cameras and maybe being able to cue and prompt and check in with their mom. That can only last for so long, and it can be incredibly stressful on the caregiver because
Mhm.
you become obsessed with that camera, and I absolutely understand how that happens, but it's not realistic for you to be kind of being that caregiver from afar and trying to manage everything through that camera. So seeing, okay, is she in the living room now? What is she doing? We haven't seen her in a while because maybe she's in a room that doesn't have the camera. She's not responding. So then you start to panic and trying to reach them, right? So you can use that for a certain period of time and for a certain, I think, level of cognitive impairment, but that can be a really short term stopgap because you're right. Having that presence there of somebody checking in or being able to have
Right.
that companion care is very different than trying to
Or just
manage
the
through.
social interaction piece. Okay,
Yeah.
so to that point then, let's say you're like, okay, it's time that they need a little bit of help here and there. How do you introduce that person without starting World War III? And
Hmm.
why are they so resistant to it? Is it that they just don't think that they need it? Is it that they don't want someone in their home? Are they embarrassed about the disease? Like, what's driving that sort of wall that they put up that makes them so resistant to the help? do you think?
It can be a lot of different things, but what I see quite often is that it feels like a slippery slope to losing their independence. So
Mhm.
that your mom may feel or your dad may feel like, okay, if I accept this help now and I let someone into the home, then what's going to happen next? Am I going to lose additional privileges to be able to maybe be driving? Or am I going to end up does this mean assisted living's coming in 6 months? And so they often kind of put up those walls and don't want to accept any type of help. And you can't force them necessarily. Sometimes you need to if it's a real safety issue and they just can no longer be in the home. But if you're starting to just introduce that first layer of help, you often have to have that conversation multiple times and kind of keep planting those seeds. And maybe if you're having somebody come into the house, maybe you first start with them doing just some light kind of housekeeping and meals and some type of things of just having that presence in the house can
Mhm.
start to introduce them to having somebody around. And even though they might not like it, they become a little more open to it just from having that routine of having somebody come in. But it feels like they're opening themselves up to what's going to be the next loss or the next chapter, if I really
Mm.
do let this help in. And so that I see it a lot, especially with men,
Mhm.
um, who really just want to be independent. They don't want their daughters inserting somebody in the home,
Mhm.
so they'll hide a lot in terms of what their real needs are. So they'll kind of cover up when they're starting to have more trouble. And that can be really, really difficult to try to sort through and figure out exactly what's going on, which is why
Mhm.
I always say to folks, be making your plans in the background. You can continue
Mhm.
to try to convince them to have some care come in, keep working on that. But on the backside, think about what would be your plan if something happens and they go to the hospital and you do need to move to assisted living or skilled nursing. Where would you start?
Right.
So, so you don't have to start from scratch when you're going through a crisis.
You don't want to be making that decision when it's midnight and your loved one's sitting there crying with a broken bone or a gash on their
Mhm.
head, and you're trying to make a good decision when you're sleep deprived and scared and anxious and your nerves are already shot. I mean, that's the worst possible time to even, I mean, this one family I was helping, she was trying to make phone calls for like 12 hours straight the next morning after she had been up all night. And that
Mhm.
sucks for everybody. That's the whole purpose of why we're doing this today is to help, share with you guys like, hey, let's not find ourselves in crisis. Let's not wait until, our loved one is sitting in an emergency room with a gash on
Right.
their head to start pursuing outside care. And let's not wait for them, but let's also not wait for you because it's
Mhm.
just going to be harder on yourself as a caregiver to try and, get care lined up at the last minute, get all of those things in order because ultimately it takes a little bit. It takes a few days. And as you
Mhm.
said, Kristen, you can wait at for some of the best facilities or even if you might live in a rural area where there's only one or two, in which case
Right.
you'll be then spending 24/7 with your loved one when you otherwise weren't planning to, and you'll be putting your
Mhm.
life on hold. So those are the reasons why we really want you guys to start thinking about what are the steps that you need to take to sort of think about your future, both for you and for your loved one. And I think, you made a really great point about, um, your loved one sort of almost being able to foresee the loss of independence for
Mhm.
themselves and how that's why they're resistant to care is because they see it as like this step down into what will ultimately be,
Mhm.
full them giving up their lives and their freedoms. And I think that that's so wise. I'd never thought about it in those terms. My mom, at least when we introduced care, it was like, absolutely not. Hell no. Get this person off my property. I'm not having it. There could be nothing worse. But, I remember at the time my brother kind of taking this approach of like, look, if it's not this, you're going to a home. And I don't think you
Mhm.
can like shame your parent necessarily into understanding what you're trying to do. For one thing, they're not going to remember why
Right.
you introduced the care in the first place from 1 hour to the next, but much less from a Monday to a Wednesday to a Friday,
Mhm.
which let's say, can I think most people try to do it that way. They're like, oh, well, I'll just get them a couple days a week. And when I'm talking to families, I'm like, I honestly suggest you doing it more upfront because it's better to just rip the Band-Aid and get them used to that person coming every day so that,
Mhm.
ultimately after a month, they'll never remember a time when that person wasn't there in the first place. And that's kind of the beauty of it is it's a really bad month, but then it's sort of like that person is there and they're most immersed in their lives and they're sort of used to it. And I think this is one of the few instances where I am a proponent of lying. And I think it can be
Mhm.
a wonderful tool in terms of protecting your loved one's dignity and their sort of right to sort of have say in what's ultimately happening in their home life. Is you can even say, especially in married couples, I've told people to just say, look, this care isn't for you, it's for me. And
Mhm.
having the healthy patient or parent, excuse me, say, honey, I'm getting older. You may be physically great and fit, but I don't feel comfortable doing all these household tasks anymore. I need help with the laundry and I need help with the meals. And I really need help getting all these heavy groceries into my car at the grocery store.
Yep.
And you put it on you. And what difference does it make if they think that they're there for your spouse or for yourself? You know what I mean? Like you don't have to tell
Absolutely.
the truth in this regard. And honestly, all the way through the end of my mom's life, I became the most crafted and skilled liar I had ever been. I mean, like
You need to be.
she spent a lifetime teaching me, to never tell a lie. But there's times in which it was the same thing with like I've told this before in the podcast, but like just getting her to change clothes. I would have to,
Mhm.
or like when her size was rapidly shifting from medications, I would take her new clothes and put dry cleaning bags over them and take them and hang them in her closet and make them think they were just hers. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's
So
very
that
smart.
so she wouldn't be resentful and like I
Yep.
didn't need all this. She was always very, upset about spending her money at the end, which is hilarious because the woman loved to shop before she got sick, but she was very, very like careful at the end. And she'd say, I don't need all this stuff and it's not Mother's Day and it's not Christmas and don't bring me these things. And it's like, I'm not, this isn't new. This has been
No.
here, forever. And I think in any time you can sort of preserve somebody's innocence by telling a little white
Mhm.
lie like that, and just also it doesn't create an issue, why not? You're not hurting anything. And in some ways, you're kind of keeping the peace a little bit. I think another way that a lot of people get it wrong is they tell their parent off the bat, hey, you need help. I see it. Everybody else sees it. It's clear that it's time to bring somebody in to help you. And I think that immediately puts somebody on the defensive, don't you think?
It does. Yeah, it absolutely does. And you can't, when you make a kind of a blanket statement like that, then that feels like a shift in their identity, if you really think about it,
Right.
right? So now I've gone to somebody,
Well,
now
it's
I've
kind of
become
insulting,
somebody that,
right?
yeah, yeah. And that
I wouldn't
feels
want to be
like
told that.
I'm not that person. I don't need that. Absolutely not.
Right.
So no, that tends to be, and you think that you're just being blunt and putting it out there and doing the right thing, but it can be way too much for them to process. And the
Right.
white lies, absolutely. Sometimes we would call them therapeutic fiblets or different things like that, but you're stepping into their world, right? And
Yeah.
so for your mom, that was much more comfortable to be able to just think, oh, this is the dry cleaning and this is, it's here. We didn't spend money buying new things. This is just what was already there. And that's okay.
Therapeutic fiblets is a good one. Now, ask
Yeah.
me on Thursday of this week if I can remember that term. I probably won't, but that's really good. I like it. Um, no, I totally agree. And I think too, the easiest way to get somebody with dementia to agree with you is almost by like doing less, saying less and making them actually think it's a good idea before
Hmm.
like it's almost like you need to convince the person that it was their idea in the first place and then they'll
Yes.
come around. It's like a psychological tool. But you sort of convince them like, hey, wouldn't it be great if like since I go to work all day every day, like what if we could find somebody to just drive you to the movies? You're always saying you want to go to the movies more, or you want to go out to lunch more, or you want to do these things. Like, wouldn't that be wonderful? Now, if you had my mother as a patient, that'd be tricky because then she'd say, well, I'd prefer you to do it, not a stranger. And I think,
Hmm.
that can also be problematic. But I think that if you have a parent that might even be open or just like a little bit lonely and open to having like more of a companion, I've heard that word be used before too,
Mm-hmm.
that can be really helpful. So moving we're going to do, guys, Chris and I were talking at the beginning of this podcast about how the financial side of sort of this next shift of like, okay, something's happened. You do have to move into assisted living or independent living.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love for you to talk through the differences between those two things coming up next. But I think what we're going to do is kind of have a second podcast to really discuss all the financial information about it, because so many people get bogged down with the cost of outside care that it just almost becomes overwhelming for any family to manage. So stay tuned for that and be on the lookout, because I don't know when we'll get it filmed, but I think that that's a very valuable thing. We just don't have time to do it today. But I do want you to talk a little bit about sort of the differences in the level of care and how to know, okay, you've done the caregivers at home for a while. That's no longer working, or you're having
Mm-hmm.
trouble lining care up, because I think a lot of people have trouble with that, right? Like somebody cancels
Yes.
and all of a sudden you can't go to work that day because it's the day your mom had to go to the doctor or whatever. But if you don't mind, could you just sort of explain the differences in care and how the facilities are looking at your loved one and how they're analyzing your loved one from the, I guess it's the word I'm looking for. Wow, I'm really doing this a lot today. This perimenopause it's definitely hitting.
I feel ya. I know just how
It's
that is.
bad. God, it
It's so
sucks so
bad.
bad. I hate it. I hate it so much. Honestly though, it makes me an even more empathetic person for this role, because I mean, I'm praying every day that it doesn't come down for me, but like it does give you perspective for what,
Sure
all of our
does.
loved ones are going through. But what is the facility looking at your loved one thinking? Like, what are the things they're looking for when they're analyzing your loved one that maybe
Mm-hmm.
you're not necessarily telling them? Like how are they looking at your mom or dad and assessing them for independent versus assisted? And what should you be pushing for if maybe things behind the scenes that they're not seeing on, like, let's say they're interviewing your mom or dad on a good day, and all of a sudden your
Mm-hmm.
mom and dad is like super conversive and talkative and fun and outgoing and whatever, but they're not seeing the 6 months of
Right.
XYZ. So how do you know when you're choosing the right level of care, and what does the facility want from you really in that determination?
So if you start with independent living, that's somebody that really is not going to be receiving any help with any of their activities of daily living. So they would live there with their own apartment in a larger community that would offer them meals. Sometimes it's just
Mhm.
2 meals a day, sometimes it's three. You'd have typically weekly housekeeping. And then there would be availability of activities, usually in independent living, but your loved one needs to be able to get there on their own. They're not going to be reminded to come, and they're not going to be able to receive any type of care service. Sometimes people will stay in independent living and bring in their own caregivers,
Mhm.
hire private caregivers or companions, sometimes even have visiting nurse and things like that to stay in independent living longer. But if assisted living really would be the next phase after that, and that would be an environment where you again still have your meals. You'd have 3 meals a day now. You'd have weekly housekeeping and you would have activities, but you would also have a nurse that would be on staff, maybe not 24/7. Sometimes they're just there 12, 16 hours a day. And you would also have caregivers. So you would have nursing assistants that would be there as well to be able to provide hands-on care for things like bathing, dressing, ambulation, if you need help walking, getting to the dining room, things like that.
Mhm.
So that would be someone who really can be in an apartment safely and isn't at risk of leaving the community, because then you're looking at more of a memory care assisted living setting, someone that can come and go, but really does benefit from having caregivers there and receiving hands-on care. The next level, really, which especially for our caregivers that listen to this podcast, would be thinking about memory care. And a lot of families really struggle between thinking, do I keep my loved one in assisted living longer? And when do I move them to memory care assisted living? Because it's a very different environment often. It's a secured environment. The programming's different. It's in a different section of the community. And so people sometimes feel really guilty about when they're making that move to memory care because, again, it's another chapter that's closing and it's another step towards needing more support. And especially if your mom or dad has lived in assisted living and now they need to transition to memory care, sometimes they're aware of what memory care is and they may not want to move there. Even though at the end of the day, when they move there, they may thrive by having additional support and specialized programming specific for folks with dementia and a different environment, but sometimes they really want to stay in their assisted living community. So that's when you really need to work with the staff and try to see, okay, what are you seeing in terms of my mom or dad? Do they seem like they need more support? Are they lost in this environment? And would they benefit from memory care? So that can be something that really requires a partnership between the nursing staff and the family and thinking about what would be best.
That's really hard. Oh man. And if you are a caregiver listening to this and you are in that situation, my heart is broken already for you because I've been there myself. And one of the things I will never forget is a caregiver telling me my mom towards the end, she could still walk, but that was all she was doing was she would just walk all day long. She would just go
Mm,
on these long, long walks, these poor caregivers. She like wore their legs out. Um, but they said every time they would get anywhere close to that memory care entrance, she would
mm,
stop dead in her tracks and turn around and they'd say, "Do you, Miss Mellon, you want to go walk through the garden or whatever?" Because they had a lovely garden in the memory care. And she would say, "No, I do not." And it's like she knew exactly what that was on some level, and she did
mm,
not want to be there. And I mean, in some ways, it's like, I think they consider it like it is locked. It's like jail. You don't have
mhm.
that that autonomy to move freely with where you want to go and what you want to do. And there's something terrifying about that because as Alzheimer's and dementia progresses, there are these losses of oneself, right? But there's always the whole person is still
Mhm.
in there and is still very
Absolutely.
present on some level. And even if it's not a level that we can access, they are still there and they know. I think intrinsically a lot of times they sort of know when that shift is being made. And even if it's not all the time, it's
Yep.
sometimes. I remember there was always this one sweet lady that would stand like at the door of memory care and she would just stand there all day long saying,
Mm,
"My family's coming. My family's coming to take me to lunch. In just a few minutes, they're coming." And I just, God, I mean, it is so heartbreaking when you see
yeah.
that. And I just think that anytime, I mean, God, Lord knows, I didn't want to put my mom into anywhere ever. Like, that was always my biggest, biggest fear. From the moment I realized she had this disease, that was
Mm,
the moment that I was dreading the most. Not just the independent, the assisted living, but like memory care, like that,
mhm.
that ultimate decision. And that's why I say, like, I'm just so sorry if you're there and you're trying to make that decision because it is so, so hard. But also, what I kind of want you to speak to is I think what a lot of people don't realize is sometimes by keeping their loved ones in assisted living, um, you can be hurting them more
Mhm.
because when they're just sitting in a room all day long every day, unless you are paying for full time, and I mean 24/7 caregiving on top of that assisted living. And guys, let's say independent living is 5 grand a month. Probably assisted is more like 7 to 7,500. And then you're talking about $23 to $28 an hour for a private caregiver on top of that. You are all of a sudden getting close to $20,000 a month in private care.
Mhm.
And memory care can sometimes be less expensive. It can be closer to the price of, just the assisted living base, maybe plus a little bit. Um, and you don't necessarily need that 24/7 care. But like in my mom's case, if she didn't have somebody with her, she was completely anxious and scared unless she was
Mm,
asleep. And what I would always be fearful of is, okay, but we don't know what she's doing when she wakes up. Like, what if she's waking up for 2 hours in the middle of the
yeah.
night? What if she's waking up super early and, you know, just sitting there in her bed and not knowing what to do or feeling scared? I mean, there is such a thing as worse than memory care if your loved one is no longer able to be in assisted living
Mhm.
safely. So would you agree with that, or kind of what would you tell a family kind of struggling in between those two lines? Because I think that's ultimately what everybody faces. They don't want to pull that ripcord on something that seems like a locked ward. At least I know I didn't.
It can be a really difficult decision. It can be, but often we would really end up seeing a lot of the times, and when I talk with families now, that when they make that move to memory care and they have that more supportive environment and typically a smaller environment that they don't have to try to navigate such a large assisted living building, it's more usually in a small neighborhood or a more contained number of residents and apartments,
Right.
that they tend to do so much better because it's so overwhelming trying to navigate through a large assisted living community. And it can be so overwhelming trying to go to the dining room and try to
Hmm.
carry on conversations with people that may not be at your level of cognitive functioning. And sometimes other residents cannot be very kind in that assisted
Mhm.
living environment when someone is really living with dementia and maybe better served in memory care. Socially, sometimes it can really be a difficult fit in assisted living. And when they are in memory care with those programs designed specifically for folks with Alzheimer's and dementia, with the caregivers who should be trained to be able to work with residents who really have those needs, people do a lot better because they have that support behind them. And the environment should be designed for that. And in a good quality memory care programs, it is. And so, even though it can be really difficult to try to make that transition into a secured program, people a lot of the times do so much better having that layer of support behind them. So I always tell families that if they're on the edge of assisted living and memory care, they're often better served being in memory care. And that's really
Mhm.
hard because I would always see the adult child would want them to go the other way into assisted living, thinking that they're doing them their mom or dad a favor by being
Mhm.
in that assisted living environment. But often they get a little lost in
Aren't.
the shuffle. Yeah, and they need
That's
that
definitely
support.
that's definitely what happened to our mom, and, we wound up having to pay for the 24/7 caregiving, and unfortunately, I kept pushing for saying, like, "Listen, when she leaves," and obviously an independent, we had been doing 12 hours a day caregiving other than
Mm,
when she was asleep. But the idea was we were going to move her to assisted and be able to remove a lot of those caregiving hours because there would be a nurse on the floor, right?
mm-hmm,
And I kept saying, no, no, that's not going to work. Like I was here and I was like seeing her every day and I was like, there's no way. If you drop those everyday supports that are in place, she's going to freak out because the sundowning had already started, by like 1 in the afternoon. It's not, everybody thinks that it's really late in the day, but it's not for a lot of people.
mm-hmm,
You could almost set your watch by it. And I was like, if she is reaching that point, she's going to start coming out of her room. She's going to be afraid. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. And I was showing up every day to check on her the week of her move. She was just hysterical and crying and crying.
mm.
And they were unfortunately blaming me for that and thinking, well, it's just because you visited her and that's upset her. And
Oh
so,
boy.
oh yeah, well, but that's a whole nother story. But, ultimately they were like, you're the problem. You need to not visit her for 2 weeks, maybe more. And then of course, when it just continued to escalate, even without my absence or with my absence, we realized, oh, okay,
Mm,
well, she really does need 24/7 support if
yeah.
she's awake, sorry, not 24/7, but like if she's awake, she needs somebody with her at all times. And in
Mm-hmm.
hindsight, same thing, what you're saying, the adult kid is like, I don't want to do memory care. I don't want to do memory care. It would have been the more humane thing, probably, to just move her somewhere where she had care constantly. And the other thing I will say, a lot of time assisted living nurses are really not trained in end of life and how to recognize specifically when
Mm-hmm.
Alzheimer's is approaching end of life. But memory care nurses are, because that's what they see all day, every day.
Right. Exactly.
And that again is where we ran into trouble because nobody seemed to notice that my mom was dying for like
Oh.
6 weeks. Everybody just kept telling me she's depressed and that she just needed to change her medicine. And I'm like watching her going, she's literally sleeping 20 hours a day. And then progressively, that was getting worse and worse. She was eating less and less. And I was sort of sitting there going, I think she's dying. And I will never forget it. They told me I
Mm.
was crazy. They were like, no, 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 no. You're that's nuts. Like, she's not even close to dying. Well, she literally died 4 weeks later.
Oh my
And
gosh.
the hospice nurses told me that they had seen that multiple times in Alzheimer's
Wow.
patients, because what looks like depression, or, they're just really have given up, they just start sleeping all the time. And that's the
Mhm.
body's like natural end game. And
It is, yeah.
if you don't mess with it and you don't start force feeding it, or, pushing fluids or whatever. I mean, I would literally go every day and I would get her like her favorite chicken tenders from this fast food restaurant. She just loved chicken tenders. And I would leave that and like a huge Sprite next to her bed, just hoping she might eat
Oh.
something. And I would come in the next morning and it would be sitting right there, where it was the day before. But yet they would tell me she was eating. Well, eating meant she'd have a bite or two of pudding when they gave her medicine, not eating a full meal.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
not
just
eating.
these signs get missed, right? We're like,
Mhm.
hey, this is the body's natural way of shutting down. Now, I will say, in my mom's case, it did happen very fast. And you would really have to be trained in end of life Alzheimer's care to have seen what was going on. Um, but I think it does happen more commonly in assisted living than in memory care, I would think.
Mm.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's definitely it's a different environment and they often don't have the same training or experience or day-to-day work with the
Right.
residents. And typically the ratios are different. So in assisted living, the number of residents that a nurse would have is much larger than in memory care. Usually in memory care, the nurse has a fewer number of residents and the caregivers have a fewer number of residents. And so they're able to watch them more carefully. It's not unusual in a traditional assisted living environment for one nurse to be there with, say, 60 residents. Um,
Right.
and maybe you'd have medication aides giving medication, but that actual licensed nurse has a very large number of residents, and so they're not observing them to that same level. And so
Yeah.
things like that absolutely get missed. Yeah.
Well, that's a big proponent for why to seriously consider memory care.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, guys, I'm like your poster child for this, of the person who wanted to avoid it, but 2020 hindsight is, pretty useless. But in this case, like, I have to say, and especially after hearing you talk about it, I'd wish that I had done it. I really do. I think it would have been a more, I want to say, peaceful end of life for my mom, but maybe, I mean, who knows?
Who knows? And
There's
you
just,
were doing you were doing what you had for edit that out. But you
I
were
know what you're
doing
saying.
you were doing
What the
everything you
best I
could with
could.
what you knew. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Right.
And you're right, hindsight is 2020, but you also need somebody to educate you on that and support you. A family
Right.
shouldn't have to try to figure that out on their own. That's incredibly difficult when you've never dealt with that before. It's easy for me to say, having worked with thousands of families. For you living it the first time, that's not something that you know to do.
Right. Which is why this is so important. Just listening to this conversation. And guys, if you are listening, share this with every single person who you know that is dealing with an aging parent, because this is really truly where you get into trouble in caring for a loved one. Um, it, these are hard conversations. These are even harder decisions. It feels impossible sometimes when you're in the moment. You love your family so much, your spouse, your
Mhm.
mom, your dad, whomever it is, and you're facing an impossible decision while you're grieving. And it's so hard and it is so deeply isolating. You can't really ask your friends about this because nobody else really knows what you're going through. And it's just really hard, but you can be prepared. And I
Mhm.
feel like the more we can sort of get the word out about like what it looks like, or what it looks like when your loved one sort of is reaching this stage in life where loss of independence is coming into play. And the more we can normalize that and talk about like, hey, you know what? We're all going to reach this place. I mean,
Mhm.
the hope and the prayer is that we all wake up one day and we either go out to the golf course or the pickleball court or the whatever, and it's like we live this great day, we have a great dinner, we go to bed and lights out. At some point while we're sleeping, the good Lord just takes you and you leave. But for 90% of the world, probably more
Right.
than that, end
Yeah.
of life does not look like that. And to
Mhm.
the extent that you can try and plan for it a little bit, is really helpful. One of the first things I tell every single person I talk to when they call me and they say, "Hey, does this sound familiar? Like it might be Alzheimer's. This is what's happening." I'm like, "Don't tell me anymore. Does she have long-term care insurance? Or does he
Mhm.
have long-term care insurance?" Because you can't get it after a diagnosis. So I'm like, just make sure you've at least got that in place because
Mhm.
the cost of care is only skyrocketing. And I saw something so great on the internet this morning. I was like, almost the comparison was so wonderful. It was Neil Shah. Have you heard of him? He leads Care Yaya, where I think they get like
Oh,
younger
I have
kids to
heard of him.
come.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I'm talking to him on the podcast later this week. It'll come out, much later, but he posted something about ICE and what a serious,
Mhm.
obviously like big deal this is in our country right now with the immigration crisis and how it's being handled and how anytime ICE is involved, well, now it's with TSA and, basically like
Mhm.
they're talking about how they're helping our agents at the airports, but the minute the airport lines get long, it makes news like that, and the minute you say ICE, it makes the news like that, and so you put them together and it's front page right now. But that's not the only crisis that's happening in this country, and the
No.
size of the care crisis is about 100 times bigger than that. And what would
Mhm.
happen if everybody that was a caregiver, including the ones at care homes, by the way, not just the private ones, like doing it for their families, but like ones that are getting paid by facilities all across America, what if everybody just went on strike for a day? And what
Mhm.
would that look like? You talk about a crisis that would make front page news. And I thought it was a great parallel because, he's right. Like, what would it take for caregivers to get the amount of attention that they really deserve? And it's to me, my heart goes out just as much for the hourly workers at these facilities and with the home health companies, because these are the most underpaid individuals in America. Now, I get it. Sometimes you have some bad ones in there that are sitting there playing on their phone the whole time. But for the most part, it takes a pretty special person to put on scrubs and to sign up for like wiping your parents' bottom. You
Mhm.
know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Like
Yeah.
those are really special people. And I just don't think that they're either A, paid enough, or B, enough attention is given to them. And man, oh man, it's just getting worse. We're going to have more and more people aging and trying to fight for the beds that are in these homes. And it's really, the cost is going to keep going up. And I think that's where our part two is going to come in very helpful for helping you guys
Yes.
understand how in the world you're supposed to afford it all. Because uh, for the average person, it's impossible. It's
It's
impossible, and
incredibly difficult. It's incredibly
it's
difficult. And you're
but
right
you've
about
got
the
all.
caregivers. It is a vital role. That is what'll make or break your experience often at a care community.
Mhm,
And it's very difficult to recruit those folks, and the pay is not competitive.
mm-mm,
So you do need a very special person who truly loves working with seniors to provide the right level of care and to provide good quality care. And it's incredibly challenging. We need to treat those people like gold because they are
mhm,
gold to us. And you're right, in the country, we unfortunately don't value them, and there's not enough light shown on that. And we have Medicaid reimbursement rates that are being lowered, and that's how we pay the caregivers in a lot of these facilities. And there's a lot to talk about there. But the financial side of families affording it, there's so much that we can talk through there. So I'm looking forward to our part two on that.
You've got great ideas. I mean, you've got stuff for like everything from what to look for in your local governments to like VA things that are
Mm-hmm.
available to you. I mean, I'm excited to kind of dig into that. But yeah, you are right. There was there was one caregiver, and sometimes even these facilities aren't giving them the care that they deserve. I
Right.
remember there
It's
was
true.
one whose own mother was laying in a hospital bed while she was watching over my mom dying when I had to go home and take a shower or eat something for a few minutes with my own family. And she was so exhausted from being up all night in the hospital with her mom that finally one day I was like, "Get on the couch." Like right now, I remember laying her down. I took her shoes off and I covered her with a
Oh,
blanket. And I
wow.
was like, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm just sitting here watching my mom die. Like, I'm not leaving this
Mm.
room. You lay down, take a nap." And the facility manager came in and got so angry at her. Or sorry, maybe it was the head nurse. I think it was the head nurse. And she just ripped her a new one and was like, "Get up. You're not allowed to do that." And was just so mean and angry. And I was like, "You know
Ugh.
what? I'm paying her right now. Like, your
Mhm.
facility might be cutting the check, but I'm paying for her hours to be here. And the poor woman needs a break. And it is okay." But I mean, that she was so scared she was going to lose her job, which was like the only
Ugh.
way she had of supporting her family.
Yeah.
My heart broke. My heart absolutely broke. And,
That
you
is
know, they're,
heartbreaking. That's
and
heartbreaking. Never mind them supporting their own families at home, which that sounds like an incredibly difficult situation, but it's so common that they work 2 full-time jobs.
mhm.
Often caregivers will work at one community full-time and then leave and go to their next full-time job. So they're working back-to-back shifts at different communities just to try to make ends meet, and it's incredibly challenging.
They're doing God's work, and they're doing it for
Mhm.
people that otherwise either can't or won't or don't or any
Yeah.
combination of the above. And I just think that they're remarkable people. I sure as heck, I wouldn't have stood a chance at the end without the help of a good number that were by my side, especially those last few days. You know, when it's end stages and you're just alone for hours on end with
Ugh.
somebody who's not talking back to you, it's really nice to have an extra set of just eyes and ears in the room with you, being able to tell you what to expect or really even just like how to handle certain medical things that are happening at that point in
Mhm.
time. But anyway, that's another subject for another day. But I am so grateful for the work that you do. Tell us how our listeners can get in touch with you if they are going through this situation and they really need help navigating the care system.
Yeah, so they can reach me either on Instagram at Navigating Senior Living. So that is my handle on Instagram, and my website is navigatingseniorliving.co. They can find me there. I have a lot of resources that are available on my Instagram as well on my website, some free resources that I have for families, both on the financial side about what to ask when you tour communities for questions, and just an outline for exactly what to expect in each of those scenarios. So families can go there and grab those resources. And I work one on one with families as well for people that really need that individual consultation. And we have a membership community. So for families, it's called Aging Parent Answers. And so
Hmm.
families can join that. We do live Q&A calls. And they have direct access to me for when they really need it, because sometimes families just need someone to ask that knows what it's like from the inside. So
Hmm.
we're able to
Hmm.
do that there.
That's amazing. I mean, that would have been worth its weight in gold for me anyway. So I can't encourage you guys, if you're listening and you've got a loved one in the middle stages of this disease, I couldn't encourage you enough. Sign up. I don't know what it costs, but pay it. It is worth its weight in gold to have good advice that you can rely on in these situations. Kristen, thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
being
It was
here
such a
and for
pleasure.
being such a delight to talk to you and just so easy to get to know. It's really been a privilege.
And thank you for everything that you do for caregivers too, especially our caregivers that are underserved, and the respite grants that you provide. It's unbelievable. And just your advocacy, we need that. So thank you for doing
Yeah.
that.
Well, thanks for helping. Thanks for helping. All right, Kristen, we'll see you back on here next time, okay?
I look forward to it. All right.
Nikki
Thank
Nick
you.
better be joining me. I probably won't get a word in edgewise, so I'll let her take over next time. She's a pretty good interviewer too. All right, take care. And guys, thank you so much for being here with us today. Please get in touch with Kristen, join her community, do all the things. And also, I will say, if you have a question for her specifically that you want to ask for the next podcast for her to address, you can send it to us in our DMs on our Instagram. All right, take care, guys. Till next time. Thank you so much.